Please welcome Grant Makers for Education Board Member Kenita Williams.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon, everyone. Do I need to say if you could hear me once? Go into our teacher mode. So again, good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be in Memphis with all of you. Again, I'm Kenita Williams. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Southern Education Foundation and a proud board member of the Ed Funders. And I will start by saying I am officially at the stage where I need readers, but I have refused to accept that totally. So I'm going to say, please excuse any stumbles. But it's an honor and a privilege to welcome many of you to the South again and to introduce our next plenary, which I know will be a very powerful and thought-provoking discussion. As you know, our conference theme is Transformative Philanthropy, Courageous and Visionary Leadership for Education and Civil Rights. This theme emphasizes the necessity for courageous and visionary leadership in philanthropy, the type of leadership that we now need more than ever, given the myriad of challenges that affect students across various demographics, geographies, and at every stage of the education continuum. This year's theme, and each of our speakers so far, have both invited and charged us as leaders in education and leaders of and within philanthropic organizations to interrogate and reflect on our roles in cultivating and advancing learning systems that offer every child a high-quality education that propels them to the opportunity-rich lives that they deserve, regardless of who they are when they enter school buildings. Our slate of speakers will build on the conversations that we've had so far in Memphis, but from a unique and critical lens, a lens rooted in the lived experiences of those who call the Deep South home, a region that has long been both a crucible of injustice and a wellspring of hope and resilience. Nowhere else in the world have education and civil rights been so deeply intertwined. The South's schools have been literal battlegrounds for justice, places where the fight for education opportunity have been waged and won for generations. Today, the South educates the largest share of the nation's students of color, students from low-income families, while being the region with the lowest per pupil spending. Way too often, all too often, discussions about the South are anchored in deficit discourse, and its rich assets, cultural heritage, and proud legacy are often overlooked and undervalued. And despite so much promise in the region, philanthropic investment in the South remain disproportionately low. But today, using the South as a backdrop and exemplar, this session is a call to examine the role of education and philanthropic leaders in advancing a broader agenda for civil rights, for social progress, and students flourishing in a way that respects place and honors the history and assets of the communities that we serve. So I invite you to listen deeply, both to understand the experience of the South and to draw connections to your work in your own context, to reflect honestly, and engage our panelists, both during Q&A and after, if you can catch them. But before we jump into the session, I do also have the honor of introducing our moderator, Tomeka Hart Wigginton. Woo! So at dinner 2 nights ago, I asked Tomeka, is there anything in your bio and many accomplishments that you want me to highlight? She said, in true Tomeka form, just tell them I'm a Memphis native and let's get the show on the road. Now, of course, she's way too fabulous and accomplished for that to be the only thing I say about her. I won't read her whole bio, you have that in the app, but I will highlight a few things from her stellar career. For almost 30 years, Tomeka Hart Wigginton has worked to improve education outcomes and increase social and economic mobility at the local, state, and national levels, specializing in building and managing strategic partnerships and coalitions. She founded the Harwick Group in 2023, a consulting firm serving nonprofit, public sector and philanthropic leaders and organizations. Tomeka has served in multiple roles, including the president and CEO of the Memphis Urban League, managing director and special advisor to Blue Meridian Partners. She's been a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's been a VP of strategic partner at our very own Southern Education Foundation, woohoo, a VP of African American Community Partnerships for Teach for America, and has had time and lived long enough to be a former middle school and high school teacher and a former labor and employment lawyer. So clearly she brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to this discussion, and we're in for a real treat with her master for moderation and the outstanding slate of speakers that we have. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Tomeka. Drop the mic. Well, good afternoon. Oh, that is pretty sorry. Good afternoon. All right, come on. Welcome to Memphis. This is my home, y'all. Welcome to Memphis. Thank you. I am so excited for GFE to select Memphis for this conference. I have a history also with GFE. I was a member and co-chair of the Equity Impact when we used to have those committees at GFE, so this organization is near and dear to my heart, so thank you. But welcome to Memphis, where we grit and grind. We love our barbecue, our blues, and our Beale Street. So welcome. I hope you have gotten barbecue. I hope you've been to Beale Street, and I hope you've listened to some blues. If not, you must do that before you go. So we have an interesting and very important conversation to have with you today. Before we begin that, though, I want to ground it in this place, in this city's layered history, in its contradiction, and in its power. And it's kind of piggybacking on what Kenita just led about the South. But we're gathered today in this city. It sits at the crossroad of some of America's most profound and defining struggles and aspirations. Right, just a short drive from here runs the Trail of Tears. Just a brutal mark in our history of our Native people being driven out of a place that they called home. A few miles away, there's Civil War battleground, where we were fighting for justice in this country, fighting for a people to be free, fighting for a country that would recognize the human dignity in all. And just a few blocks away sits the Lorraine Motel, the place where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, that now is the home of the National Civil Rights Museum. And Dr. Martin Luther King was here standing for justice, standing in the feet of Memphis sanitation workers. So this place is important to our history, and this conversation couldn't be more important. I'm excited to have this time with some key leaders who are Memphians, who have been in this work. We're going to have a conversation about the crossroads and intersection of education and civil rights and the role of philanthropy. We want to talk about philanthropy roles as an honest broker, not just a power broker in this space. And so I invite you to welcome and join with me 3 panelists. I'm just going to give their name and rank and file, and they'll give you more as we go into the questions. But we have Dr. Tequilla Brownie, the CEO of TNTP, the first Black woman. Come on, give it up. First Black woman to serve in that role. Tequilla has a deep history at all levels, including right on the ground here at Memphis City Schools, where she led some important work in partnership with one of our philanthropies that she'll talk about. We also have Venita Doggett, who is Executive Director of MICAH. It is the Memphis Interfaith for Coalition for Action and Hope. Venita also brings vast experience, also having worked in city government, at the school board, in the school board office, in advocacy, in philanthropy, so she brings a wealth of knowledge. And lastly, we have Daniel Kiel, who is a FedEx professor of law at the University of Memphis, Cecil Humphreys School of Law, my alma mater. Thank you, Daniel. And Daniel has done great work in chronicling the history of civil rights, not just in Memphis, but in the country, and so he'll bring a wealth of knowledge. When I was asked to be part of this panel, I was asked to tell the story of the school system. And I said, that's a very biased story for me, though. Like, I can't tell it through other lenses. And so we bring Daniel because he'll give more balance, including in areas where I was not always right. But for me, I was always right. So we're going to get started right now. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? All right, great. So we're going to start with you, Daniel, and the conversation, we want each of you to answer, what is the story of education within the civil rights agenda in Memphis and the broader Deep South, and what role has philanthropy played in that?
Sure, and just confirm that you gave me 5 to 7 minutes to cover all that
I kind of
history.
gave you 3 minutes,
3
but go
minutes,
ahead.
Okay. So one thing that Tomeka did not mention that I think is common for all of us is I'm also a Memphian. I grew up here. I work at the University of Memphis now, but I also was a student in the Memphis Shelby County schools, then the Memphis City schools. And it's that grounding of my personal story, I think, that really contributes to what I work on now, you know, the issues that I'm most interested in as a law professor and as a researcher. So I obviously can't cover all of the details of the history of schooling in Memphis in the amount of time that we have here, but I want to highlight a couple of things that you may not know, because I suspect there's some familiarity with the general trajectory of education, the quest for educational justice in the South, and maybe the Memphis version of it as well. So I was going to highlight a couple of things. Tomeka mentioned a Civil War battleground. The education, especially of African Americans in Memphis, begins shortly after the Civil War with freedmen's schools. And I'm noting this because one thing you may not know about Memphis, I think a lot of people are familiar with the sanitation workers' strike in 1968, but there was also a significant, during Reconstruction, known as the Memphis Massacre, sort of altercation between local Memphis police and federal troops, including some black troops. And that led to a riot and eventually the passage of the 14th Amendment. It was a sort of significant moment in galvanizing Congress towards that. But what I want to highlight from that is that during this massacre, the primary target for sort of the local vigilante actors was the freedmen's schools. And so there's several sort of illustrations of this at the time, and it just shows to me how sort of central education is to this story of justice and this story of uplift, but also how contested it is. That even in this very earliest stage of trying to deliver some form of learning for young people who had been, you know, it had been illegal to educate them before, even in this earliest moment, there's such contestation and resistance. So I'm going to sort of skip through. I think maybe there's a general familiarity with the development of the education, you know, education sort of becoming what we know it is today. But I'll highlight a couple of things that are relevant, I think, to this group and relevant to Memphis. Memphis is a site of over 60 Rosenwald schools. These are during the Jim Crow era schools that are philanthropy funded, meant to serve African American students who may not have had access, especially to high school opportunities, which, you know, especially in the earliest part of the 20th century, you know, were somewhat scarce and different than how we imagine it now. My experience as a Memphian is what sort of brought me towards the study of the 14th Amendment and racial justice in schooling. And that story can't be told without Brown versus Board of Education, which is kind of central to my work. A lot of people know that story very well, but a lot of people don't know the story that the sort of strategic kernel that gives Charles Hamilton, Houston, and Thurgood Marshall their opportunity to devise a plan to take a litigation-based hatchet to Jim Crow is a philanthropy, is this Garland Fund that sort of funds the NAACP to craft what's known as a Margold Report, which is the strategy, the sort of groundwork that leads ultimately to Brown versus Board of Education. So a couple of connections there. Just fast forwarding now, you know, obviously I'm skipping over a lot of things. My own schooling experience here in Memphis, I went to what's known here as optional schools. Many of you would know them as magnet schools. They were schools that I didn't recognize at the time, were designed in order to keep people like me in the urban school system, the central city school system. But I have come to realize that, and I have all sorts of mixed feelings looking back on the resources that were sort of focused in on my schools and allowed me to get what I think was a terrific education. I didn't recognize, I thought every school was kind of like my school. I had the opportunity during middle school and high school to travel around a little bit more and got a sense that, actually they weren't all like my school. In most of the schools that I visited, basically every face that I saw was an African American face, and that struck me as, whoa, that's interesting. And so at the time I wasn't thinking much about it, but when I was in law school I started thinking a lot about it, and that sort of led me to study the history of schooling here. The immediate, I think, call of our panel is to talk about a specific thing that happened about 15 years ago out of the norm that I experienced in Memphis schooling, which was that the vast majority of students in the Memphis city schools were African American, although my schools were much more diverse. And there was a surrounding suburban school system that served a smaller student population. It was a little more diverse, but it was predominantly white. And that was the norm in our community for really decades. Once desegregation kind of stalled in Memphis in the early 80s, that kind of became the norm here. And Tomeka would definitely give you a biased version of this, but there were significant fiscal concerns about the way we funded our schools at that particular time. And there was a concern that the Memphis school system and the school system that was serving the vast majority of students in this county was going to become fiscally unsustainable.
Fiscally broke.
It was going to be unsustainable, and so there was a strategy that came into play at a particular moment, which I think Tequilla and Venita can speak to, about Memphis being kind of this hub of education reform at this particular time. A lot of that fueled in part by philanthropy and as well as race to the top money. And so the strategy was to dissolve the city school district and trigger a merger of school systems in our county, so that we would have had, instead of 2 school districts, we would have 1 school district serving about 140,000 students. It still would have been a majority African American district, but it would have been far more diverse. It also would have, to my mind, reflected the reality that our education, of everyone in this metropolitan area is tied together, right? That we all, how far we go depends on all of our education. So I'm not going to give a lot of details on that, but I'll just give you the end game. We had a merged schools district for 1 year, and subsequent to that, due to a variety of factors, we had 7 school districts. We now have 8 school districts operating within Shelby County. And so the largest district remains what's now known as Memphis-Shelby County Schools, which is more or less the pre-existing Memphis City Schools, and then all of the suburbs have their own municipal school districts, and there's one university-based school district that is just operating this year, took some schools out of the city district. So I'm going to stop there and let you guys do your thing.
See, he gave a very nice version of that story. I'll tell you, I'll be downstairs later if you want to hear the actual tea. The actual racism and all the other things that were impacted in that decision. So Tequilla, you have a unique story as well, and I know I can already tell we're going to run out of time because there's so much to talk about on this panel. But from your vantage, your experience on the ground nationally as a student, all the things, like, what is that story for you?
Yeah, so thank you, Tomeka. I just want to first acknowledge Grant Makers for Education, Sarah, Sneed, and the team for you all being here in Memphis. As I say to my good friends from across the country, Memphis, yes, the birthplace of Elvis, but also of me. So I think it's also, so it is important to me for that reason. And so, so I'm going to fast track, right? So I, again, born here, grew up, in the area, raised. I actually was raised out in the rural area. So raised by my grandparents who journeyed from, Clarksdale, et cetera, in Greenwood, Mississippi, and did not have a formal education. So we didn't have indoor plumbing, for the first 12 years of my life. My first job, I chopped cotton. This was the Deep South. People look, no, I know, I don't look 100. I see y'all looking. I'm not 100, and so my son and his friends think I'm a dinosaur, but this was the forgotten Delta, right? The Deep South that, again, I want to honor the fact that you all are here in this room today. It is a testament. So fast forward all that, right? Like, so my childhood lived experience, and I'm going to fast track to my tenure at Memphis City Schools. I joined the district in 2004, and I chose to come home. I was fortunate enough, went through public schools, went to Yale undergrad, but knew I wanted to come home because who's moving to the Deep South, right, to effect change, but for its residents and the citizens who live here. And so I remember going into Memphis. We, were doing our work. I was a researcher at the time, and a lot of conversations around the country about education reform. And I'd hear a lot of my colleagues in the education space say, oh, education is the new civil right. And I'm like, new? Because for us in the South, my grandparents instilled in me, education was power, right? It represented something. And so I'm like, it's not a new civil right. It is the civil right for us. And so in Memphis, we're doing the work on the ground, had the luxury and the benefit of receiving deep investments to really catalyze the work in Memphis, anchored around teacher effectiveness. So in my naivety, right, I'm in my 30s, and I'm like, oh, wow, we get this $90 million grant from the Gates Foundation. And then we also receive lots of significant funding from local funders, Hart Foundation, Poplar, et cetera, FedEx, you name it. And I remember the call when the co-chairs, Bill and Melinda Gates, were announcing that Memphis was the recipient, their largest at the time, to a single site. One of our own local reporters said, and I paraphrase, but only slightly, why on earth would you invest here? And so the expectations of hopelessness, and I applaud, it was the time Melinda French Gates who answered the question and said, well, we actually see hope and see opportunity. And if you know, as Tomeka said, we grit and grind, right? I mean, we continue to do the work. So we're in the work, working on trying to improve through the lens of, teacher quality, teacher effectiveness. And then along comes the merger. And the story about the work in Memphis, at the time we started the work, as Daniel really sort of put it, it was literally the luck of a draw. Your ability to get an effective teacher, it was literally luck, right? And despite all of the work. And what was interesting at the time of the merge, we knew this in Memphis City, so we were going about significant reforms to change that trajectory. And at the time of the merger, Memphis City Schools, the college readiness rate was 4%. Abysmal, right? Let's agree. Now, the mean household income was about $14,000, I think, at the time. And in that merge process, as we started looking through the data and the baseline for both districts, ironically, the college readiness rate for Shelby County schools, any guesses? No? You want no takers? 19%. Well below the national average at the time, which was 32%. But I mention that because the conversations that were happening around the merger were all about the failure, the abysmal failure of Memphis City Schools. And I'm like, if you step outside of the county, we're actually failing all of our kids. I mean, 19% is at a 32% nationwide rate is nothing to write home about, especially when the median family income was 3 times that, right? It was 50 to 60,000. So I mention that to say, because as we were talking about forming the merged district, looking at the policies, I asked Tomeka before we got up, are we gonna have the real conversation here? Because for me, as we were going through those conversations, I wanna just name, it was kind of traumatic. It was the first time in my life, my lived experience, where because I worked for Memphis City Schools and because I was African American, it was assumed that I was dumb. And I say that with every, this not just anecdotal, I have the receipts. Like I could share with you some of the meetings and conversations I was a part of. And it let me know that, are we really serious about doing the work to improve the outcomes of young people like I was? This is home. I never wanted to stop and leave the work undone. Unfortunately, and I'm gonna end here, in 2012, the end of 2012, 2 years into this, when I had taken on basically a second job, which was doing my day job, fulfilling the responsibilities of our partnership with the Gates Foundation, but also doing all of the work to stand up the new district, I realized it was untenable. And when those that were in power were asking questions like, Tequilla, we can't just make, choices for the majority. We've got to make choices for the kids who have choices. Do you hear that? And I mentioned power there because, again, if we're saying education is the new civil rights, every policy instructor I've ever had said you judge a policy by how well it is having outcomes for all people and not disproportionately for one. So I'm going to pause there because I could go on, but I just want to name the last thing is that education as a lens of civil rights, it didn't start with the ed reform movement. It was always anchored here in Memphis because we knew that education meant liberty and meant freedom.
Kenita, Tequilla, thank you. That is, okay, there we go. That is just a powerful story. And so also I want to thank you all for having this conversation because some of these topics, and when you really delve into it, they are hard to really think about what your impact is on that. So also, much like my colleagues here, I am a native Memphian. I grew up really, as I would say, at the corner of Jackson and Hollywood, so that means I am North Memphis. But I had the pleasure of going to what would be one of the first schools that was integrated in Memphis, which was Springdale. And so this is the 1980s, which I'm sure Daniel can talk to you all about how we integrated like in 73, right? So this is 1980s. I'm still a baby in this point in the world. But when I looked at my classroom was extremely diverse. I went back actually last night and took a look at a few of the pictures, and the class itself was literally maybe 10 black students and 8 white students at that time in about 1984. As I then matriculated through the school district and went to the school that I was actually zoned for, which Springdale was around the corner, so I walked to school there. But then I went to Cypress Junior High, and you could immediately see, this is again like 1989, the stark difference of a school that is now predominantly black. The resources are not there for students. The supports are not there, but yet it still is a hallmark of fantastic educators like my math teacher, Velma Lois Jones, who was just honored this past week at the Freedom Awards, right? So at that point in time, we're now really deeply ingrained into what are optional schools, and I remember that my mother camped out at the fairgrounds in order to get a slot for me to go to Snowden. So that was 7th grade year, 8th grade year. I am now back in a school that mirrors really what Springdale was for me. And then I would later attend Central High School. And so what that does is really kind of give you a framing of there are some differences, but you can't quite yet put your finger on them. As I started working for the city, you could see all of the other things that we sometimes don't believe are interconnected. They are, in fact, interconnected. And so optional schools was, as Daniel mentioned, this response to try and stave off white flight. At that point in time, this is early 2000s, we are in the middle of this housing boom, right? So the further reaches of Memphis and Shelby County are now calling cards for move here, no city taxes, but which is also code for move here, you are not a part of Memphis City Schools. And so that hallmark of what is still integration, segregation that is now being permeated through real estate practices shows up in how we talk about the language for our school district and whether or not we even believe that it is important to pour resources back into our local school district. I then have the wonderful privilege in 2008, right before the charter surrender, began to work at Memphis City Schools. And it's that point in time that I realized, oh my goodness, everything is now laid bare because I'm doing the research that says our funding is going to be impacted, this is what it looks like across the state with other school districts that may not have to support, or other counties that don't have to support their school districts. How do you get outside of that? And then we're now opening up much larger conversations as this battle kind of unfolds for, are we going to integrate schools? And I am out because part of my job as research person, right, for the district and policy analyst is to go out, listen. So I am now out in the county, listening to conversations, ask a question. Is there some reason that you had not provided funding or paid into extra funding for school districts? And I'm literally told, we did not want to do that. We didn't want to have an ADA split with Memphis City. We don't want our money to support the school district, Memphis City Schools. We just don't want that. And also because my friends live in the outlying communities, as we're again talking about this and thinking about education as a civil rights, the language of the old resurfaces. When someone says, hey, Venita, we're hearing that they are going to bus students out here. Is that true? It is 2009, 2010, and we're still talking about busing students when that practice stopped in the city in 1992. So when you hear or think about where we are, what that front looks like, and then the setup for philanthropy to enter into the room, and again, think about choice, and I'm just gonna lay this here and we can come back to it and talk about it later. As we're thinking more about choice, we also see in a space that does not want to share resources with school districts, what it means to also begin starting to split the pie in so many different areas where the pie is not enlarged. Right?
So we're going to talk about leadership and the role of philanthropy, but just to understand this history and this story. So my story is a very traditional Memphis story. I don't have the, somebody came and saved me. My elementary, my middle, and high school are all in the bottom 5% of the state that lives in the bottom 5% of the country. So I experienced both the optional program that Daniel and Venita have talked about and my neighborhood school. I went to my optional school in the 7th grade because the district wrote to my mother and my father and said, basically, she's too smart to go to the school around the corner. Send her to this other school. Like the district did this, as if they were not the people deciding the resources and what school would have. So we went to that school one year, 7th grade. 8th grade, though, by the 8th grade, I was missing my neighborhood friends because during the day at school, nobody lived in my neighborhood, and after school, nobody in my neighborhood went to my school. As an 8th grader, that was troubling for me. It was harsh. So I asked my parents and begged and cried and asked them to transfer me to my neighborhood school about 3 weeks into my 8th grade year. In that transfer, I had to give up 8th grade algebra and I had to give up French because it's allowed at the optional school. But somehow I couldn't handle it if I go to my neighborhood school. So these are adults making these decisions. This is not the fault of my neighborhood, which was a working poor community. It was not our fault. We had a bunch of smart kids that lived in ours, but somehow this system, this district, didn't believe we were smart enough to have a building around a corner from my house that can provide that. So when we're talking about these decisions, because we talk about the system as if the system is a room full of machines, the system is just a room full of people making decisions that are harming people every day. What kind of leadership, and specifically the role of philanthropy, right? Because there's a story here, like I said, with Gates invested $90 million in Memphis, right? I was the school board chair at the time, and then 6 months later, we win Race to the Top. It was really clear to me that Gates had written Race to the Top because it was the exact application we had for the grant that we made. So we know that there's power. We know that philanthropy is in the room making decisions. How can they get in the room and be the honest power broker on behalf of people and not just wielding weight that still keeps making the system do what it does? I'll start with Venita and then we'll just come back.
Yeah, so I think a lot about the time that
we're going to run out of time, so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think about a lot of the time that I spent at Memphis Education Fund where we were doing strategic investments in local advocacy groups and other groups that are supporting kind of this education reform effort, right? But one of the things that I brought into that lens was thinking about the partnerships that we have, and there being real, true strategic alignment among them. So it's not just a hodgepodge of different things. There's an underlying thought, right, that we want to see. In particular, I'm going to pick on the fact that we got additional education funding statewide through a formula. But that took knowing that there is a statewide effort for Ed Trust that is working to mobilize communities across the state and thinking about what does each person need and getting those folks in the room. It also takes local advocacy organizations, which I'm currently the ED of at MICAH, where we're building base and talking to community members to see what is needed and supporting that space. And it's also thinking about what are the actual policies that we need to move and who can move them well. And all of these things require, I think, a real level of trust on behalf of the funder, because I've got to trust that these folks are going to be able to do that work, and I also cannot micromanage how they do that work, and I really want to put a pin there. You cannot micromanage how they do that work so that they can move strategically together, and having them foster collaborations among each other. But they were already doing these things. You can't put one person in the room or organization that simply doesn't understand the value of collaboration. The funder needs to understand it, the program officer needs to understand it, and then also think about how long it takes to move that. When we started talking about student-based funding at the district level in 2015, it becomes 2022 before you actually get any sort of legislation that can move the needle. So that's 7 years worth of work. And if I'm expecting as a program officer that it is absolutely immediate, that's not gonna happen. That's just impossible, because for every win that an organization does, there's another setback, because there's another piece of the puzzle or the powers that be that pushes against them. So for philanthropy, I would ask that you be honest and open with what your strategic alignment is, where you want to go, but then also not put your hand on the scale so that the organizations can actually move the way they need to, and trust them to make those decisions. They're on the ground. We can write all of the policy think pieces that we know, but when I knock on the door because I'm canvassing in a neighborhood and I talk to a parent who tells me about the issues they have at their school, and then they start formulating issues that speak to that need, you have to trust that organization because they may know what they're doing.
Thank you. And Tequilla, like you bring specifically around what we're talking about, Memphis, you bring such a unique perspective. And this is always a full circle moment when I think about that time, because as I said, that $90 million, Tequilla was actually charged with implementing that investment with the Gates Foundation. Who knew, right, that years later she'd go work for TNTP, who we contracted with to build out most of that work. So she was leading that relationship both with Gates and TNTP, and now she's CEO. And later, I went to work for Gates, but I also told Bill Gates in his face that I was going to work at the foundation one day. And who knew? And then I did. But you know, you were in the leadership role as the district, but you were having to manage this relationship and this funding with Gates. And so be honest about how philanthropy showed up in that major moment that's moving major work in the system and how it should have shown up.
Thank you, I think.
You didn't
for
want to
the
say you wanted a
question.
real conversation.
Yeah, I did. I asked you that. Because why waste time being here, right, if we're not going to have the conversation? So, I mean, the resources that were invested here in Memphis were very, very meaningful. Like, one of the things that I sleep well at night knowing that here in Memphis during that period, we opened schools fully staffed for the first time in the history of the district. So that's palpable, right? And so that was immediate impact, right, to think about that. And when I look at sort of the role that philanthropy played, and as we think about this honest broker, I think there's two things that come to mind for me. One is success is actually defined and determined by who defines success. And so even with the grant, with that work, even now, there were people that didn't know I was from Memphis. They were like, they assumed I came with Gates. I'm like, I was born at City of Memphis Hospital before we named it after Elvis Presley. I'm like, no, I'm from here. So, and so when I have conversations even now about the work, I hear a lot of people say, oh, that was wasted money. It didn't do anything. And I'm like, did you forget to mention that 2 years into the grant, we kind of had to fold, you know, the work, it shifted the work. And success, therefore, a narrative about the work and what success for how unsuccessful the work was. As the lead on the ground, of course, it would be perceived that we're doing the work and would have a biased perspective. I'm a researcher, I understand that. And so as I think about the power and anchor that philanthropy did have and could have, again, yes, there's resources, financial resources, there's social capital, there's political capital. If we look at the current state of where Memphis was then, where Memphis is now, frankly, but also where nationally, where the country is, the size of the weight of what we need to galvanize the movement to correspond to the weight of the crisis that we're in. Look across like the room, do we see that? I mean, think about the resources it took to build a movement around charter schools. There were dollars, there were resources, there was political capital, there were like all the things. We don't have that now, and unfortunately in Memphis, when it came to the merger, we slid. We galvanized around securing the dollars and getting it off the ground for Memphis City, but once it became about the merged district, we immediately went to a scarcity and a zero-sum mentality. I was in, again, I told you I have the receipts. Here's a micro example. We're in a room with lots of local reporters, funders, et cetera. Someone in the room, I was the only African-American person in the room, someone asked, Tequilla, how long will it take for these changes you all are implementing to take effect in the merged district? Now, this was a year in, and I said, well, you know, I answered some sort of way. And the person went on to say, parents are worried about, get this, the complexion of their children's school. And I'm like, now, of all adjectives you could use, that's the one you chose to use. Philanthropy was in that room and remained silent. So I felt like for me, as the lead on the ground, I felt really alone in that moment. Again, I didn't need $10 more. I actually needed the philanthropists that were in the room at that table to open their mouths and kind of name what was just said.
Yeah, pretty powerful, thank you. I will give credit. We were in the political battle of our lives at the time of this, and just a year or so into that investment, and the paper kept questioning, if you do this, Gates will take all their money. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking like, Gates, I need you to speak up. And Vicki Phillips called me and said, we will not do that. And then I was able to say, no, they won't. And so that was a powerful moment and we appreciate it. But Daniel, we'll give the last opportunity to you because we are running out of time. But mainly, you know, we talked about leadership, but how can philanthropy, how does and can philanthropy show up?
Yeah, well, Venita hit on trust. I think that is hugely important here. And the story that Tequilla just shared, I think, is one that illustrates kind of what I think is really important. The reality that we experienced during this time of the merger was a political reality. So I think several of us have used the word trauma. And for me, the trauma was I was hearing echoes of the very same things that I had studied historically being said all over again. So some of it was direct, like I think some of the examples that have been given. The idea that we were going to be doing busing in this merged district was preposterous, but yet that was illustrating, and of course busing was code for the complexion of the classrooms. And so all of that was the reality. But so for me, the trauma was watching this happen and thinking, oh, because I've studied this in the past, and it's easy to look to the past and say, here's where we made a mistake, and here's where we made a mistake, and here's where we made a mistake. I made the mistake of assuming that because something was a good idea, everyone would agree with it. And, you know, we don't live in a world where people agree with things just because they're good ideas, and we live in a world where people, you know, are contesting whether or not something is a good idea. And I suppose on some level that's good, that contestation is good. But it also means that being a good idea is not enough. And so just bringing it back to philanthropy, I think that there has to be an acknowledgement that there's going to be resistance to anything that's going to move the needle towards educational justice. In our situation, that was a political reality in which our state legislature had disproportionate power over what was going to happen within the merger process. That's something that could have been anticipated, but it also could have been, I think, confronted a little more boldly by people who were more eyes wide open about the political reality that we were going through at that particular time. And so I would bring that back to trust in the people who are here, who are saying, look, we recognize that this is a powerful idea that we are trying to bring to this community, but in this environment, we need to be able to address these headwinds that I'm very familiar with because I'm here every day, that you need to keep in mind as we sort of work towards this common goal.
All right, well, thank you. I think, so correct me, I have 5 minutes? A little, oh, so that means I got to probably take a question and a half of a question. So is there a question? Anybody have a question? Otherwise, I'll have them close out. And I can't see if there's a hand. I knew Jeff Livingston was going to have a question. Oh, we don't have a mic. So you have to stand up and speak loudly, I guess.
There's a mic.
Yeah, there's a mic.
Okay.
Are you from Itabena, Sidon, Money, or Greenwood in the orange?
The pink?
Pink, yeah. Did you say you're from Mississippi Delta?
Yes,
Yeah, are you
my
from-
family's from Clarksdale and Greenwood.
Yeah, there you go, Clarksdale. Great. Clarksdale or Line?
Clarksdale.
Okay, all right, yeah. Keith Fulcher Community Foundation of Northwest Mississippi. We have a satellite office in Clarksdale. And I'm from Vicksburg, Mississippi, where 2 AKA presidents sent a medical van to Mound Bayou, Mississippi, and there's a historical marker there, and they're still sending that. So all AKAs stand up and take a bow.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. I shall not hold that against you, sir. Go ahead. I'm going to shout out to Jeff. I shall not hold that against you. Go ahead, Jeff Livingston.
A5. No, but my question is this. For those of you who lived through the merger of a black city district and a mostly white suburban district, and then saw it fall apart, what would you do differently today? Just because you have a lot of time.
So first I want to make it clear. For the Memphians, so just be clear, I was the agitator of we must surrender the charter of Memphis City Schools. It was really not a kumbaya, let's be together. It was to stop the county system from removing suburban dollars from Memphis. So the only way to ensure there's a countywide tax for education and everybody, whether you live inside the city of Memphis or outside, pays into it, is to ensure there was a county district. They were trying to cease being the situated county district and become what's called a special district. The only way to ensure that there would be a county district was to become it. So I knew they were going to split off. What they were not going to do was create a 50,000 populated student separate district forever that didn't rely on Memphis. Force them to create 7, however many smaller districts. So I knew they were going to split off. It wasn't kumbaya. It wasn't we're getting ready to change the diversity. It was run me my coins still. And so that's why we did it.
And how I would answer that, Jeff, it actually, for me as a leader, it actually, became, the enemy became my footstool, and I'll say it that way. And the reason I say that, I learned so much about sustainability in that period, because for me personally, as I was grappling with, can I sleep at night in a space where we're actually knowingly not making choices from a policy and practice perspective that are in the best interest of all kids.
Yeah.
So as I was going through that process and figuring out that the leadership was not going to be in place to enable that, and so I had to make personal choices, I immediately, this was a 7-year investment, but I saw like, oh, if we don't codify the work through policy, again, top-down change does not sustain, bottoms-up often doesn't scale. So I learned like boots on the ground on how to meet in the middle, like to leverage that top-down for sustainability, and the bottoms-up to scale, like bring those together. And so like my last day of work for the district was getting the policies that we had been implementing passed for the merged district. So I learned, so if I had to do it again, I wouldn't go through that again. But what I did learn that I apply even in my job now at TNTP, the districts, I'm like, if you want this work to sustain, you can't do it in spite of the community. There is no private investment in spite of the public infrastructure. So at TNTP, we work a lot with helping districts and communities braid and blend funding. There's no other way to maximize and leverage both and really focus on sustainability from the beginning. Yeah. Authentically, not just the little footnote at the end of a proposal and we actually don't invest in it.
So what I'm going to do is take that question and then you can answer both of them because we got 5 minutes left. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I love you guys and admire you, and then I love you telling this story, and thank you for the gift of that. And I think the moment that Memphis was in is a moment we're back in, where we're going to have budget shortfalls and declining enrollment all over this country. We are going to have to solve for the fact that we are designed with these bad lines that make it expensive and ineffective to equitably educate all of our kids. So another hypothetical, which is like, if you had to do it again, but you had the support of a legislature, which I know, like, let's suspend. We're not in Tennessee. We're in another state. But like, if the legislature had to figure out how to balance a budget and require redrawing of lines, Tequilla, you just described what needed to be done from the ground up. But what different things could we be doing from the top down that might support this direction as well?
Well, I had a good answer to the last question. I don't know. I mean, I'll note the lesson I took from this experience is fight harder. My instinct, my temperament, my job is as educator. I ended up through this process ending, just sort of falling into being like a community educator on what was going on. And I think that there was a failure to articulate like a competing vision. There was a very clear vision outside of the city of Memphis of what should happen, and I think that there was a lack of a clear vision inside the city of Memphis. In terms of if we existed in a world with, where we could impose something, my sort of law professor hat, we don't need to do funding the way that we do funding, with connection to property tax. There was a period where people were starting to articulate a vision that was different, that we could do something different on that front. And school district lines don't have to be as important as they are. I think that's just a reality that has been the case, since the 1970s. It really became fixed, and school district lines are just way too important offenses in our communities.
And the only quick thing I would add is, I would say to imagine what's possible, like instead of just envisioning, staying sort of within a framework where you're just moving the chairs around, if you will. It's like, okay, what can be possible? Some of the things we're doing now, in our work, as districts are facing declining enrollment and having to close schools, it's like, okay, you can't approach this just as, okay, how many schools do I have to close? And I'm like, actually, how do you need to sort of revisit your whole programming, right? To make sure that more kids have more opportunities in this reality. Continuing to just move chairs around, you're gonna get the same results. And so this is where I think philanthropy can think outside of the box and actually fund the R&D work to help districts do that. They don't have R&D resources.
And then also want to add to that is, Inside of that is also a conversation that should have been had, which you see that happens actually in community mobilization and community organizing. It would have been really powerful if we had had time and space to really spend the time within communities, within churches, within neighborhoods where we knew that there were folks who were inside of suburban districts who actually supported the merger and were willing to bring that forward, but we did not have enough time. So I think it also becomes incumbent upon philanthropy in these spaces to allow us to move past some of these polite conversations that we don't want to venture into, and then allow people to do the really hard work of really getting down grassroots again. How could we envision this? What could it be like if all of these things were possible for all of our students? And how do we make it work and then equip folks with the money and the resources in order to do that hard work of bridging community?
Thank you. There is a resource link, I'm sorry, we didn't put it up. We're going to share, it should be on slides that has resources, some awesome work by Daniel that goes deep into this. So there it is. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll briefly close this out. Just wow. I knew and we anticipated that this plenary was going to be a powerful and thought-provoking one, and I think our speakers and moderators have beyond delivered. Please join me in thanking them again. A special thanks to my soror and devastating diva of Delta Sigma Theta, Sorority Incorporated. Oop. Just thought I would say that. Each of our panelists was selected for their leadership qualities: integrity, conviction, purpose, and as we can all tell, their wisdom based on the gems that they've left us with. I'm hoping that everyone was able to take away new insights or nuggets of wisdom that you'll reflect on for the rest of the conference and beyond, of course. I'd like to share a few that were just especially resonant with me. Philanthropy needs to show up as an honest broker, not just a power broker. We can't keep talking about systems like it's a room full of machines. The system is a room full of people making bad decisions, and we need better people in the rooms. The enemy can be a footstool. I like that one. I'm going to take that one. A reminder that top-down isn't always sustainable. Bottom-up is not always scalable. We need to meet in the middle. And that a critical reminder that education as a civil right is not new. It's not a new lens that's always been anchored in place and has led to liberation and freedom. And so as we close our time this afternoon, I'll leave you with one more thing, because we, again, are in the South. They say, as the South goes, so goes the nation. And the South has always been the first author of progress in this nation in so many ways. I hope that you're enjoying your time in Memphis, but recognize that we are not here by accident. So many lessons can be learned about education and civil rights, how the two are really woven together. And once you pull one thread in the wrong direction, the fabric of opportunity for children can unravel totally. So, please enjoy your time, enjoy your afternoon panels. Please keep that in mind as you reflect on your own courageous and visionary leadership that can lead to transformative philanthropy. Thank you.